Hey everybody, welcome to another live event here at the Poison Pen. My name's Pat. I'm pinching in for Patrick Milliken as our Facebook administrator today. Tonight we have a wonderful conversation with Will Staples and his newest novel, Animals, and I'm going to leave it to our store owner, Barbara, to host the interview.
Thank you, Patrick. I'm really delighted. I'm holding up the book because, see, we have a real wild animal loose in the store. Will, can you hear him? Sorry about that. We thought it would add authenticity to your event. I'm holding up the book because A, I'd like you to see it, and B, this is my reminder to say that we do have autographed copies of The Poison Pen. It is our March crime book of the month, a book that I really love, and I'm very pleased to be able to discuss with Will. Will, is this your, in fact, debut novel?
It is, yeah. I had never planned on writing a novel until this one just started gnawing at me, and I knew I had to do it. So now I've got more planned, but this was the first.
Wow, you've caught the bug, right? Open a vein. What is it? Larry Block said, just open a vein and it goes. But you have the most impressive resume for a person who hasn't actually written a book. So I'm going to crib from the back of the book to make sure that I understand it all. Your work includes, as a scriptwriter, I'm assuming, do I have that part right?
Yeah, scriptwriter, occasional producer on things, but yeah, mainly writing.
Okay. Mission Impossible franchise, the Jack Ryan and Shooter television series, and adapting Tom Wolfe's book, The Right Stuff, as a TV series for Disney. But here's the one I love, because I don't absolutely zip about gaming, is that Will wrote the video game Call of Duty, Modern Warfare 3. And I'm going to let him tell you why that is such a phenomenal thing.
Yeah, so I mean, that one came up during the 2007 strike. All of the writers were walking out in Hollywood, and we had nothing. We weren't allowed to write, and it turned out that the first Modern Warfare game came out around that time. So we all would sit around playing it all afternoon, and we fell in love with the franchise. And then 4 years later, when they needed somebody to write the third in the trilogy, for me, that was the equivalent of writing, a Star Wars movie or something like that. I just absolutely loved the franchise and the idea of picking up the torch. It was one of those things where you knew that before you even worked on it, whatever box they put on the shelves would break whatever entertainment records existed. So yeah, I mean, that one ended up in 17 days grossing $1 billion, which was the fastest of anything in history, including movies, television, anything. And I don't attribute that all to the writing, but I try to do my part.
Well, why not? I mean, if it looks good on your resume, let's put it that way. Yeah. And I mean, I don't normally say anything about finances, but I do want to say that one of the reasons I was attracted to this book, aside from the fact that I'm fairly passionate about the subject of animal poaching myself, having been to Kruger on a photo safari and seen some of the horrendous damage and how the rangers try so hard not to reveal the location of endangered animals like the rhinoceri. But anyway, Will is donating all of the proceeds for writing this book to, well, you tell them.
Yeah, it's one of those things where when I was doing the research, so many people took me in to teach me about it. Damian Mander at IAPF, Sean Wilmore at the Thin Green Line, Jane Goodall, Carl Lamont, who is deep in the world of investigating tiger trafficking. And all these people are doing it because they're passionate about the issue, not seeing any financial of writing the book and profiting off that. It just didn't feel right to me, given how much help I got from people who were giving everything they had to the issue. And obviously I do fine in the rest of my professional life. So the idea of doing one where I can give back, it just felt like the right one in this case. And so, yeah, the money is, I've already started distributing the money to IAPF, Thin Green Line, Jane Goodall Institute, and then I'm continuing to look for other organizations doing work and hopefully use the book to raise some money and awareness. So, yeah.
Well, I'm delighted to participate in that project. And you'll note I laid a foundation for the fact that you could actually do this without ending up in the gutter yourself. But how fortunate. What caught your interest in, I don't know if you know that there is an author named Brian Christie who has written not a similar book, but also a book. And we're going to be talking to him in in a couple of weeks.
Oh, great.
And he's a big deal at National Geographic. That's where his background. So I read your books kind of like back to back. And one of the things I love about fiction is that you can take essentially a situation that's similar, or even components that are similar, and yet you can write completely different books. And in fact, you did, which is a good thing.
Yeah, it was. I came to it from an unusual place. I'll give you the version that won't take up the next 3 hours, but I was working on another project set in Eastern Congo, and got to know Damien Mander at the IAPF because he was helping consult on that. And he was aware that there was an animal trafficking project, a movie in development at Leonardo DiCaprio's company, Appian Way, and Warner Brothers. And so I put him in touch with them in case he could help out on that. And it turned out they didn't have a writer. So it became sort of a circular reference where then he suggested that I would be a great guy to write it. So I ended up getting hired by Warner's and DiCaprio and Tom Hardy and Tobey Maguire to write an animal trafficking movie for the three of them to star in and produce together. And that's sort of the kind of team that you just say yes, sight unseen. And then I assumed, like other issues I'd written about, that because it's such a big deal, there would be a lot of information in the public about it. And it turned out that, all the information that you can really find publicly available is focused on poaching in sub-Saharan Africa and ivory markets in Asia, because that's what, journalists have more ready access to. And as for the distribution, because it's not a law enforcement priority like drugs and guns, very little is known about the distribution channels. And so at that point, it was sort of a choice between writing a book that was where you just sort of made it all up and did a disservice to the issue, or go and try and figure it out. And so that was when I just, started reaching out to all sorts of folks and piecing together the research. And so I think the combination of the research and the mandate to develop it in a certain way for Hollywood, is part of the DNA that made it what it is.
How did you pick this particular, or how did you create this particular character who leads your story? Or his name is, he has an interesting name, Cobus Venter. Is that a South African name?
Yeah, it's a composite. It's a South African name, just a composite of some different characters I stumbled across in real life. The actual name itself, it was important. When somebody says, "Can you write a movie for three, Caucasian stars that about an issue that takes place primarily in Asia and Africa?" That's something you've got to be very, because nobody wants to see, a white savior story about outsiders coming and solving. So I was trying to come up with really important to come up with complex characters that were flawed, and ideally had flaws that were emblematic of, what's really going on with the issue, like apathy, people feeling just ground down by the futility and hopelessness of it. And so I sort of tried to imbue that into the characters and write some very dark characters. And so that was sort of how it all came together. And then I didn't know who those characters would be, but through the research, I ended up having conversations with people and then landing on who those characters would be. So for example, I was talking to a guy who did specialized insurance about his work insuring private animal collections. And it was not the person that I thought would end up being a character that you write for Leonardo DiCaprio. But as soon as the guy started talking, I was like, oh my God, this guy's Rick Blaine from Casablanca in the world of animal insuring and trafficking. And that's a character that I really want to write. And so, started developing that. And similarly, the Cobus character, the ranger, isn't based on a single person, but I had, a number of conversations with rangers that were just, look, how hard is this issue for you? And what's the worst thing you could imagine doing in your darkest moments? And, none of them had done the thing that Cobus does in the story, but that their honest answer to that question became the choice that Cobus makes in the story. And so, it was just one of those things where, mining for gold in the research and found some stuff that I felt like I could spin a yarn out of.
Were you able to explore how different countries in Africa deal with this? For example, Botswana versus South Africa, because my very weak understanding is that they have quite a different approach to how to handle poaching.
Yeah, I mean, the countries all have different approaches, and the approach also, there's so many factors like, obviously, where your country lies on the corruption index, because the countries where the trafficking is the biggest issue, are pretty high on the corruption index because politicians are looking the other way. And the other issue is what types of animals you're trying to protect. So, in South Africa, the elephants are out in the open and grazing, and you can generate a lot of money through tourism. Whereas in Central Africa, if you're talking about forest elephants, they're really hard to generate revenue off tourism to protect. So how do you protect them? And so one of the only ways to make it financially viable to protect forest elephants has been these sort of hunting operations. And so then you're sort of faced with this weird dilemma of is it better to finance the protection of animals through hunting them or not? And those are ultimately, I felt like my role in the story was to shine a light on these questions and let the reader make their own choices about how to address it. And then also in Asia, each country involved in trafficking is involved in a very different way. It's a very complex issue with really sophisticated criminal syndicates involved, which was not something I expected coming into it.
Are the criminal syndicates primarily Asian? I mean, is there much of a market for either poached ivory or whatever they're going for? But mostly it's either medicine or it's artistic, as far as I.
Yeah. So basically, it actually mirrors narcotics in a really interesting way, where drugs are like cocaine is produced in the developing world, and then it's distributed through places like Mexico, and then it ends up in the developed nations like the United States and places like that. And with animals, it's very similar, where production, if you want, at the animals in areas here in Africa, and the primary consumers are in China, Vietnam, Laos, Myanmar, and even in all those countries, it's primarily a certain segment of the Chinese population that is driving demand and going to those places to buy those things. And the syndicates then tend to be based in those Golden Triangle countries, and their business is distribution. And if your business is distribution, you're going to use those distribution channels for everything illicit. And so, if you look at Zhao Wei, who runs the King's Roman Casino in Laos, he's been accused by the U.S. Treasury of narco trafficking, human trafficking, money laundering, and wildlife trafficking. Similarly, the syndicates in Vietnam are very similar. In Myanmar, in an area called Mong La, there's a warlord who has his own autonomous region where anything goes, and it's on the Chinese border. So people just come right over, do everything that they're not allowed to do at home, and then go back. So, yeah, I mean, it was very interesting sort of seeing how those people operate, and they're in countries where nobody's very interested in shutting them down.
What is the end user buying for? What is it?
Yeah, so that's a really important misconception that I was hoping to dispel with the book, is that I came into it, little I knew was, this is traditional Chinese medicine. There are people for whom this is part of their culture, and I'm sort of torn between wanting to protect animals but not wanting to judge people for their cultural beliefs. Turns out traditional Chinese medicine has disavowed the use of these animals for years. And the new movement in animal trafficking is what they call from health to wealth. So, you can only sell a certain amount of rhino horn powder as rhino horn tea to, cure cancer or whatever else you're saying, keratin is going to cure. But you can move a lot more if you're selling it as jewelry or as a fine dining meal, or as statues. And so when I was in all of these places, sure, you could buy rhino horn powder for medicine, but that rhino horn powder was a byproduct from the carveries that were carving these much more elaborate things, because a chunky bead bracelet made of rhino horn, you can move 100 times as much as one dose of medicine. And the only place I encountered on the trip where people genuinely believed in the medicinal properties of rhino horn, for example, was Vietnam. And that's only because the criminal syndicates in Vietnam have actively cultivated the story that rhino horn will cure cancer. And they're going and fleecing all these families whose kids are in cancer wards in places like Hanoi on this false promise. And the gangsters, I mean, these are not people who believe this themselves. They're just trying to gin up demand for their product. And so, I went to some of these doctors who were selling these products, and it was comical that, whatever whatever ailment, whether it was a hangnail or sexual issues or whatever, I was being offered the same animal parts because that's what they were in the business of selling. Primarily, you know, it's primarily tiger and rhino were the ones that that you'd find in that region, but also a lot of ivory, pangolin, et cetera, et cetera. But, you know, when somebody's going and buying a tiger banquet at a casino, they're not doing it because they think it's going to cure their arthritis. You know, the chef might say, oh yeah, it's going to help you out with this and that, but really you're buying exclusivity, you know, just the same way, you know, a Rolex is, you don't buy it because it tells time really well, or you don't buy a Ferrari just because you like the handling. People are buying these things as status symbols, and it's obviously not all of China, but you know, you have a country whose middle class is larger than the population of the United States, and some segment of them is going to want things that are illicit status symbols, and they're finding their where these things are for sale, and those places are completely operating in the shadows.
That's so interesting about the rising wealth of those countries. The middle class undoubtedly has increased the demand. I can certainly see that. I mean, China has an ancient Asian tradition in ivory carving and all that, you know, really beautiful stuff. And the same way that when I'm in Alaska, you know, the walrus carving and so forth is spectacular. But I hadn't really, I guess I too thought that a lot of it was still the whole Chinese medicine myth, and that Vietnam was maybe even more powerful about that than today than China.
Yeah, Vietnam is massive for demand. I went in a place called Horn Village, which is just an entire town outside of Hanoi, controlled by a criminal syndicate, and it's very hard to get in. But once you're in, it's all out in the open. Every store is selling illicit animal parts. It's really wild. But you know, when I was going to these places where I was able to get animal parts and where I was able to DNA test them and confirm the authenticity, these were all places where I was being offered underage prostitutes, you know, narcotics, everything. It was, you know, these were playgrounds where people went to get all the things that they weren't supposed to get. This was not places where people were taking their grandparents to try and, you know, a last ditch cure for whatever ailed them.
So tell us the story. I mean, we've talked all around it here, but how does the story actually kick off? We can only go so far because it's a no-no to expose too much of the story, but let us in on the beginning.
Yeah. So when I was constructing the story, it was really, you know, the whole idea, to put it bluntly, is sort of like to hide the peas and the mashed potatoes with this, you know, and like give people the information, but package it in a really entertaining story. But the story, to achieve what I want to achieve, had to traverse the entire issue, you know, geographically and throughout the supply chain. And so I developed this, and so, you know, to me, I really wanted to explore the convergence of tiger trafficking and rhino horn trafficking in particular. If you look at the distribution chains, obviously tigers do not come from Africa, and they converge at that middle point, the distribution point, in Southeast Asia. And so I wanted to start a story concurrently, you know, one thread in the United States with tigers, and then another story in South Africa with rhinos, and then have them braid together fairly quickly. And so the two inciting incidents in the story, one is a ranger in South Africa who's struggling with the fact that no matter what the rangers are doing, the bodies of rhinos just keep piling up, and the futility is just agonizing. And this just came right out of conversations with rangers there. Day one, when I showed up in South Africa, Damian Mander, who's involved in anti-poaching, took me to a trial for a ranger who was out in the field taking tourists around and then sending geotagged photos of the animals to poachers in Mozambique, so that as soon as he took the people away, they could go and kill the animals. And so, you know, you're in Kruger fighting to protect these animals and not knowing which people around you are in on the game and corrupt. And so, you know, one character, after the death of several of his ranger friends, and decides that he's not going to win fighting it the way he's going to fight, and he makes a very dark choice to try and curb demand in Asia. And then the other story, it was so funny, was, you know, because I initially started cooking up this story back in 2014, and I was trying to come up with an interesting angle into tiger trafficking, and I was talking to an epidemiologist, and he was saying that one of the issues with the ways tigers are bred right now is that it could create a global pandemic. And so started developing a story about a tiger virus that had the potential to jump to humans, and what that would mean if you were an insurance investigator investigating a death at a private zoo collection in the United States. And I've been intrigued by this notion that there are more tigers in private collections in the US than in the wild throughout the world. And so, having a character who is stumbling across this virus and realizing its significance. And then it was funny because then, set up the book with the publisher and was editing it. And then all of a sudden COVID happens. And I was like, everybody's going to think that I'm the guy chasing the news cycle with this book. But here we are.
You'd be chasing it with pangolins more than you would be chasing it with tigers. But I think, that I'm trying to remember what it was I was just looking at. Maybe it was the New York Times on Sunday, yesterday, about a circle of animals in which the possibility of viruses, jumping were very high. Certainly the pangolin was one of them. I think the tiger might have well been. And yeah, I think that unfortunately, these kinds of things, just like the wet markets, expose us to a higher degree than maybe we've realized before, that viruses can jump. And and here's the result that we get. In the same way that, deforesting the Amazon may be releasing viruses, or scarily enough, as the permafrost is thawing. I talked to an author the other day who pointed out that when some animal in the Siberian permafrost, I think it was might have been a reindeer or something. Anyway, when it thawed out, it released smallpox, and the villagers all got ill because people don't have any kind of immunity to small. I do, because I'm old. Honestly, there are few advantages to being 80, but one of them is that you have been vaccinated against everything. I've got polio, I have got, smallpox, I've got yellow fever you name it, but an awful lot of younger people don't have. And there isn't necessarily even enough, may have to start all over again with vaccines. I can remember when the polio vaccine came online. We were not allowed to go to the beach in the summer, because everybody was so terrified of the virus. And then just about the time I think I went off to Stanford, Dr. Salk came along and, became a hero. But the animal trafficking thing and so forth exposes us in lots of ways that we might not have been so aware of. Another interesting thing, Will, too, we're talking about the danger to animals, but when we were in Kruger, we had a very interesting ranger who drove us to Pretoria to catch Rovos Rail to go back to Cape Town. And you look at the fences and so forth, and you think that they are designed to keep the animals in and to keep the locals safe from the predatory animals. But as it turns out, the fencing now is to keep the animals safe from the predatory people, because an elephant apparently had managed to break through a fence and get to a village. And I think they said within an hour, there was nothing left of the elephant. So
yeah, it's really complicated because you have, if you go to Mozambique, it's like if you're in Kruger, you're like, oh, this is Africa. This is what I see in National Geographic. And then you cross the border over into Mozambique right there. And it's just the earth has been stripped. And then you've got, folks living in Mozambique who for 10,000 years have been hunting these animals in, with perfect balance between them and the animals. And now if they've got these animals that are worth tens of thousands of dollars that might stumble into their backyard when they're not going to make any money this year. And that's sort of their birthright. Yet if they shoot that animal, they can be shot on sight. But if a wealthy American or Russian comes and goes to the private hunting reserve just down the road, they can pay $60,000 and shoot that animal. And it's fine. And so it was, I went to a private hunting reserve in Mozambique, and it was really shocking, some of the stories that we heard. At the time it was pretty sleepy there, and I asked why, and they said that they had a quota for the number of animals of each type, the number of each type of animal they're allowed to kill each year, and that a wealthy Russian billionaire had come early in the year and said, I'm not leaving until I kill every animal on your list. And so they had proceeded to chew through the list, and now they had finished up the quota for the year, and they couldn't really do any more hunting. And they had actually had an issue that they were not able to find the last lion in their quota. And so as it was told to us by one of the locals, the people who worked at the hunting concession had gone to the Kruger fence, cut a hole in the fence, tied a donkey to a tree on the Mozambique side, and then set up the Russian with one of the same rifles that had been used to shoot Taliban at 2 miles away in Afghanistan. And from 50 yards away, he got his lion there. And so I found that stuff really fascinating. One of the private hunting reserves in Mozambique had made a deal with the locals that they would build a school for the locals in the village in exchange for setting up a hunting concession as an act of goodwill. And we drove by the school, and it was a cinder block hut. It was just a cinder block box that was empty. And that was what they did. They came, they built a box, said, there's your school, do what you want with it. And now we're going to kill all your animals.
I am not a fan of Mozambique. I was so horrified when we stopped in Maputo, Mozambique,
Oh, yeah.
which I might point out has the train station actually designed by Eiffel, the same Eiffel who built the beautiful tower in Paris. Mozambique, Maputo were once like, jewels of French colonialism, and they have just, and I don't really know why. Well, when we were one of the first people to travel in, I'm going to call it Burma, you can call it Myanmar, from Mandalay down to, I'm going to call it Rangoon once again, by boat, which was truly fascinating. And yet, when you arrived in Rangoon, what you realized is that they threw out everything that was British. They didn't keep any of the stuff that worked. They just completely dismantled it. So nothing worked. The trains didn't work. The post office didn't work. The whole place was a complete disaster. As opposed to, let's say, India, which, managed to keep the railroads going and some other stuff. And I don't know whether Mozambique is another example of that, where they just decided they would dismantle the entire colonial structure. But the problem is they didn't have anything to replace it with, and, or know how to replace it. So I can see that, these animals are in many cases the only real monetary resource that a lot of people have, in the same way that people plowing up the Amazon are, their choices do that or starve, even though they are wreaking havoc all over the place. And I don't, those questions are morally so difficult. I don't have any idea how to answer them.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's the colonial history with, European countries, and then there's the neo-colonial stuff happening with China right now. Obviously they're incredibly savvy with exercising soft power, and, China's making a huge push into Africa.
Right.
And, anytime you dump, hundreds of thousands of people from any population into a region, some amount of them are going to be, looking to engage in nefarious activities. And so, it's much easier now, if you're producing animal parts in Africa, to connect with the Asian supply chain now, whether it's things going through diplomatic pouches out of embassies, or just people who work at various, companies building roads and things like that in African countries, who are working a side operation, moving animal parts. There's so many different, that was one of the hardest things writing the story, is that I stumbled across so many different, completely unique distribution channels. It was hard to choose which ones to feature. Like I was being shown ivory bracelets that were being painted brown to look like wood. And then when they arrived in Vietnam, they'd take the paint off. And so that those would all go through sort of big major shipping channels, whereas other stuff was going through diplomatic pouches. And then the biggest thing that nobody's talking about is the farming of endangered animals, which it just seems to be the best kept secret in the world of wildlife trafficking, that all of these animals are being farmed in these horrible places. And we went in, I went to a bear bile farm, and it shook me. I mean, I think I probably lost 10 pounds in the next 2 weeks after it. It just, one of those things where you just can't stop crying after you leave. And, some guy chased us out with a shovel, but, you're looking at bears, and you're like in a warehouse. And as far as you can see in the warehouse are rusty cages with black bears pinned down on their stomachs with catheters hooked up, draining bear bile, because it's going to help as a hangover cure for people. And so you see just these psychologically devastated animals being farmed. And if some writer like me from LA, who knows nothing about animal trafficking, within 3 weeks can be in a bear bile farm in Botan and Laos, I find it an outrage that people who could actually make a difference aren't doing it. These law enforcement in these countries know this is going on, and they could just walk in and shut it down in a heartbeat. But the local authorities are making money off it, and the U.S. and other countries that could exert financial pressure on them aren't doing it. So I think with a little diplomatic pressure from the more powerful countries in the world, some of these countries that aren't making a lot of money off of it, but are making a little money off it, would quickly shut it down.
Well, you've got a point, but then you also mentioned the Russian billionaire. And so unfortunately, in some of the countries with the money and the clout to shut it down, there are plenty of people who really think that, it's a different colonialism, but the Chinese are building this big railroad in Africa, and what's that going to do? But how is that really different than the 19th century people as different players? But
yeah, and there's that. I think once you start looking at this stuff in a broader perspective, you sort of realize that we're all living in glass houses. Like, we're all out there trying to protect the animals in Africa because it's just the one place that we haven't really gotten to all of them yet. But you look at, you go to any natural history museum in the United States and you see that, oh yeah, we had more megafauna than Africa. There's a lion on the coat of arms in England, and it wasn't because there were a bunch of British people like going to Africa on safari 1,000 years ago. It's because there were lions in Europe. And so, North America, Europe, we just hunt and destroyed everything that we had. And now we're looking at these other places and saying, no, you can't hunt your stuff. And obviously we don't want to just destroy the last animals as well, but it's also very hypocritical of us to come in, given our own history, protecting our resources.
The real problem is there are too many people. There are too many people in the world. I had said for a long time, jokingly, but I had said for a long time that Mother Nature generally issues correctives, and that one of them might be a real pandemic. And while this one has been tragic and the death toll is high, it isn't going to even touch a rebalance. So, I don't know. We are a successful breeding population, more so than they are. And I don't think there's a fix to that. So anyway, I thought your story was very good. And I think the issues are very important to look at. And sometimes the lens of fiction makes it more accessible and more thought-provoking to people than trying to wade through a journalism article or a nonfiction. So,
Yeah, I was thinking, when I finished the research and everything I was thinking about doing as a book, I was like, what, the two approaches would either be exposing all of this as a nonfiction book, or bringing sort of my unique skill set of translating these things into fun narratives to it. And it was really important. I was worried that if I did it as a nonfiction piece, the only people that would get exposed to it or choose to engage with it are people who already care about the issue. And I wanted to create something that people would buy just because it's a cool book, and then hopefully come out of it with a deeper understanding of what's going on. And the goal with the book isn't to be an evangelist for a certain point of view, or have people come away with me prescribing the way the world is supposed to work. My hope is that people who are avid hunters, who are meat eaters, and people who are vegans, and people who think hunting is distasteful can all read the book and find some eye-opening questions in it, and at least make some choices for themselves about what type of world they want to live in and what role they're playing in it. So at least the choices we're making are conscious and not blind.
Well, what's the best of fiction, the best of crime fiction, which is the thing that I read the most of. It's about character, it's about landscape, and it's about story, but it's underpinned by real issues, by really serious issues, whether you're Sarah Paretsky writing about major corruption in Chicago, or Will writing about, worldwide corruption in the animal trade. I have been an addict for this kind of fiction all my life because I like learning things. And it's astonishing how a great story will stick in your mind and teach you things in a way that an article in, in the paper or a chapter in nonfiction will not. For a lot of people love reading nonfiction, but for many people it feels more like drudgery or, you know, back to school or something. And as you say, it tends to be self-selective in that people who really care about the topic are more likely to read it. So, you know, good for you. What are you intending to do next? Are you going to continue with these characters, or are you thinking about writing something different?
So yeah, so I mean, it's funny. I've got my little Hollywood career is continuing in tandem. So I'm busy. I've got a couple of movies and TV things I'm working on at the moment. But the next book, it's going to pick up one of the characters from Animals and introduce a whole new cast of characters, and it's going to explore basically militias and warlords in Central Africa, specifically unrest in Eastern Congo, and the forces at play there. That was another issue that I came across through my Hollywood work, and was just immediately impacted by how unexpected and complex and interesting it was, and how nobody, except for a few, you know, journalists who are doing incredible work, are talking about it. And so that was another one where I said, you know what, like, if I could come in and write a knockout narrative that's just hopefully just an exciting story, then I could shine some light on that issue as well. So that story is going to be essentially a Western, but set
African Western. Why not?
I mean, African Western, and really about, you know, that it explores, it actually, the genesis of that project was somebody very high up and connected to the issues in Eastern Congo, suggesting that after they'd seen the Joseph Kony 2012 videos, that maybe the best thing that somebody could do is have a rich person like them hire a group of outsiders to come and take the warlord out. And that is a proposition, is a very interesting and complex one. And we all know that these issues aren't that simple. And that idea, once I started pulling on that thread, I was like, oh, wow, that's the kind of thing where, just sort of the way the Westerns, you know, it's like they can start with this simple mission and then explore all the nuances of law and order and human conflict and our society's addiction to chaos and how people benefit from chaos. And especially in Eastern Congo, this idea that chaos isn't an accident, it's not a byproduct, that chaos is the product, and that everybody from top to bottom is actively creating chaos because they benefit from them, whether you're countries like the United States and China, or warlords, or private companies trying to get your access on minerals, that everybody is benefiting from chaos. And to pretend that we're not is to misstate the issue. So anyways, not too long on, but that's, I've been thinking about that one a lot.
I really like it. And I have to say that events in the United States in recent times would tend to totally support your theory. So it's not going to seem strange to Americans that chaos can be a desirable and, in fact, achievable.
Yeah,
well,
it's an interesting.
I'm not going there. I'm not going to be political, but nonetheless, we've all experienced deliberate chaos. And
yeah, it's a question, you know, this idea that people out there, whether they need to be hurt, punished, not, they at least need to be taken off the field. Intervention is not always the best policy, and so I think that's interesting. The idea of, like, even if a mission is undeniably, it can have so many, I'd say, unintended consequences, but we know what those consequences are going to be going in. So I don't know. I find that complexity compelling. I mean, I'm always looking for stories that allow me to ask really interesting questions, not answer them. And so that's when we're like, oh, this is complicated and weighty, and I know how to create characters that are gonna you know, tug at those strings. So yeah, that's the one that I'm waking up at 3 a.m. periodically with the notepad, writing stuff down. And I'm not going to start writing it until I'm ready, but I've got a little bit of stuff to keep me busy in the meantime.
Wow. Well, I can't wait. And certainly your screenwriting background gives you a skill set that you can bring to a novel that's remarkable. Patrick King, are you lurking there in the black square? Not sure that he is. Yes. Right. So do you have anything? I know so much fun. It's like Ariel. It's like calling Ariel up to, you know, I feel so Shakespearean when we do this. Do you have any comments or questions from the Facebook audience you'd like to address?
So I think that Will answered Sarah's question about what he's working on next. I did tell her that I'd pass along the question, but I think you answered it fairly thoroughly. Tanya Plank said that, you know, the topics that you write about are so upsetting, but so important to expose. And she just wanted to thank you for writing about it and donating the proceeds to the animal organizations.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where you look at these issues and you're like, God, I can't bear to look at this. And then as soon as you're done looking, you're like, I can't bear not to look at it anymore, because now that I've seen it, if I turn my back on it, now I'm part of the problem too. And so, I'm not an angel, but it's like one of those things where like, I have to do this,
Right. I had a question for you, actually, Will. So, writing a novel versus writing for a video game is fairly different, because I would assume that writing for a video game like Call of Duty is more a choose your own adventure style of writing, where you had to think of all sorts of dialogue options. I am curious if doing that was great training for writing your first novel.
I think, because I write in games, TV, film, and I think, and now having experimented with a book, I think all of them are great cross training for the others. You develop different muscles that you wouldn't if you were just staying in that one medium. With games, it was really interesting. Games are the most collaborative medium I've worked in. Ultimately a game succeeds or fails based on whether it's fun to play. And that's just the reality. So as a storyteller, you have to accept that if your story isn't facilitating gameplay, then it's not a good story, even if it feels really emotional and great to you. And so, working on a Call of Duty game, it was a very iterative process of me proposing story points, them saying, you know what, we built that out as a mission. It doesn't play well, but we have a mission of somebody running around on a sinking ship or whatever. So find a way to work that into your story. So it was a lot of back and forth, very collaborative. You don't have a lot of authorial control. You're there to support the team. Sort of like a lot of the movie stuff you do. You come in for a few weeks, you try and improve the script as much as possible, and then you hand it off to the next writer to do their job. Writing the book, it was the first time I've ever written something where then it wasn't processed through either a development team or filmmaking team and cast and things like that. So for better and for worse, I felt very naked writing it. Like, oh my God, like if I use the wrong word here, it's not going to get corrected on screen or something like that. I've got nobody to blame but myself for what's on the page. So I put a lot of pressure on myself. And I also was aware of how bad at screenwriting I was when I started it 20 years ago and how long it took me to get good at it. So I had a healthy dose of insecurity I knew what I didn't know going into my first book, which was a lot. And so there was a lot of, fear can be a powerful motivator when you realize that you're a neophyte at something and there are a lot of people who've been doing it for a long time.
That's the wonderful thing, though, about the editorial process. And Barbara's talked about this before. You can fix plot, you can fix a character, you can't fix voice. And clearly you had a strong voice for this novel.
It's not just that you can't fix voice, you can't fix boring. Which is kind of the same thing. I mean, I've edited, probably 800 books or something. And, Patrick's right. I used to say that to people. I can help you with everything else. But, if you're boring, there's nowhere to go. And boring does relate to voice. And, if there's no personality coming through, if there's nothing that pulls the reader into the story, which really is voice.
That was definitely something that's been ingrained in me, having been in the film industry for a couple of decades. It's so unforgiving, film and TV. If you have a boring scene, it's just not going to survive the editorial process. Film in particular, when you're talking about big blockbuster stuff, the audience wants to get from one great moment to the next with almost nothing in between. And, when you're working on an action movie, usually when you come in, it's like, okay, we've got a car chase, a plane scene, and this, let's figure out how we're going to get from A to B to C with as little as possible. And so I think, I for better and for worse, came at the book from a perspective of like, what are the knockout scenes that I want to write and how do I get from one to the next as quickly as possible. And I think that's probably why the first draft was about 40,000 words. And then I was like, all right, we got the tentpole stuff. Now it's time to really let it breathe and build it out. And so that was a fun process.
That is such an interesting point. I worked on a book with a Hollywood gentleman who was used to writing scripts and so forth. His books would come in and they'd be like this. And I would say to him, you have to actually tell us. You can't, because nothing's going to show us. There's nothing visual that is going to happen that's going to explain how the room looked or how the people look. You have to provide all that stuff that the camera does for you. And it's hilarious because the opposite problem, of course, is that writers overwrite it all, and they show you and they don't tell you, as the old classic goes, and then you have to whittle it down. So, but I can well imagine that you would have written a 40,000, basically a novella.
Yeah, I built it out before I submitted it to publishers, but even when the editor was assigned to the book, Michael Carr, who was great, I made sure to let him know, like, look, be brutal with me. Like, all I care about is looking like I know what I'm doing with this thing. And so he was really great about challenging me and helping me protect the vision when I needed to have confidence in what I had on the page. And so it was a really fun process. And I initially went into this thinking, I'm just going to write this one book and get it out. And then, to your point, once I wrote the book, I said, all right, now I've just got to write my second book and get it out. So
one of the most frequent conversations I used to have with authors is I would say, what about this? And they'd give me a whole explanation and I'd say, that's great, but you didn't write that down.
Right.
I mean, it isn't any good if it just is in your head. You have to, you can't assume that the reader can go inside your head. You have to put what's on the page is what the reader gets.
I think it's also an interesting challenge when you submit things to, friends, family, whoever to read, that you have to remember that people bring their own values.
You bet.
Material. And so that was a hard thing when somebody would say, I found this upsetting or distasteful or whatever in the book. And then you have to think to yourself, because maybe you not liking it is the point of that thing. Not that you didn't like the quality of the writing, but that you were offended by that or whatever. That's my goal with the writing of it, that I don't want you to feel safe when you're reading it or not, and knowing when what they say is when to course correct and when to understand that they're just seeing it a different way because of who they are.
Well, you will get feedback from this, which may very well influence how you choose to write another book. Patrick, was there anything else?
I don't see any other comments. Just people really, it seems like they're really enjoying it. We've got quite a few people watching us, just not a lot of comments right now.
Well, it happens. So, Will, it's really been a great pleasure. Let me say to those of you who are watching, a reminder that we do have autographed copies of the Poison Pen you can actually purchase. There will be a podcast that will come from this discussion that will be available on the Poison Pen website under podcasts or on Podbean, probably tomorrow, but definitely not any later than that. And also it will appear on the Poison Pen YouTube channel, and it will live on our Facebook channel forever, thanks to Patrick King figuring out how to do that. So bravo to you, Patrick.
Apologies for a couple technical hiccups there.
No, you did really well.
I forgot how to hide myself.
You seem to have, I realized that. You seem to have tamed the wild animal that was loose in the store, which is Patrick's little tiny rescue dog who has a very loud bark. So it's been fun. Will, what a pleasure to meet you. Thank you so much for spending time with us this evening.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you shining light on the book. All I want to do with it is raise, awareness and some money for the causes. And this is tremendous.
Well, it's really been a pleasure. So we'll look forward to your second book. And in the meantime, we'll probably connect in some fashion. So good night, everybody. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks.
Bye.